Every machine that spins has a hidden point of failure, the place where a shaft meets its housing. In 1899, in Gothenburg, Sweden, one factory kept losing that fight. Gammelstadens textile mill sat on soft clay soil. Every time it rained, the ground shifted, the building settled, and the drive shafts bent by fractions of a millimeter. That tiny bend was enough to wreck the ball bearings supporting the shafts. Machines stopped constantly. The mill's maintenance engineer, Sven Winquist, was the one sent to fix it, again and again. Winquist studied a 1902 report by a German professor comparing ball bearings to plain bearings. He became convinced a better repair wouldn't get him there. The bearing itself had to tolerate misalignment. For a year he worked evenings and weekends, sketching designs on his own time while still doing his day job fixing the same shafts he was trying to make obsolete. In spring 1907 he had it, a double row of balls sharing one spherical outer raceway. The inner ring could tilt freely without losing contact. Misalignment stopped mattering. He installed it on the mill's shafts. It worked well enough that Gammelstadens re-equipped the whole plant. The owners realized they had a product on their hands that other factories needed too. Winquist was 30 years old at the time, an engineer from Kumla in central Sweden, not a wealthy industrialist. He'd been hired at the mill for maintenance and repairs, not invention. On February 16, 1907, Svenska Kullerfabriken, SKF, was founded as a subsidiary of the textile mill. Axel Karlander, son of one of the mill's owners, became chairman. Winquist ran it as managing director. Established plain-bearing manufacturers didn't take the new designs seriously. Self-aligning bearings sounded like a workaround for factories with bad foundations. The patent for the multi-row self-aligning ball bearing was filed May 21, 1907, and granted 3 weeks later. Within the year, SKF filed the same patent in 10 more countries. Winquist didn't wait for orders to come to him. He traveled across Sweden and into Europe, personally demonstrating the bearing to more than 100 companies in a matter of months. By 1909, SKF had opened offices in Germany, France, the United States, Britain, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Russia. A 5-year-old company from a textile mill was already selling worldwide. World War I reordered global trade in 1914, and demand for precision bearings surged. SKF used the moment to acquire its own steelworks, so it no longer depended on outside suppliers for raw material. In 1924, 2 SKF employees, Assar Gabrielsen and Gustaf Larsson, pitched the board on something outside the bearing business entirely, building a car designed for Swedish roads and Swedish winters. The board approved it. 10 prototypes were built through 1926 and 1927, fully funded and owned by SKF, inside the same company that made bearings for other people's machines. On April 14, 1927, the first production car rolled off the line in Gothenburg, the open-top OV4, nicknamed Jakob. The company was called Volvo, Latin for eye roll. Volvo struggled to turn a profit in its first 2 years. In 1929, SKF's board seriously considered selling the young carmaker to the American company Nash Motors and cutting their losses. Gabrielsen argued them out of it. SKF kept Volvo, and the following year it turned its first modest profit, the deal that almost erased one of Sweden's future industrial giants at the boardroom table. In 135, Volvo listed on the Stockholm Stock Exchange. SKF distributed most of its shares to its own shareholders and stepped back to focus entirely on bearings, the business it actually understood. The name had been sitting unused since 1915, when SKF first registered it as a trademark for a bearing line aimed at the American market, a plan that went nowhere until it became a car company's name instead. SKF kept close ties with Volvo for years afterward, even selling it the Hisingen factory building in 1930, supplier and former parent, still doing business with each other long after the ownership split. By the late 1930s, SKF was a global manufacturer with factories inside multiple European countries, including a major plant in Schweinfurt, Germany, that made bearings for German industry. When war broke out in 1939, Sweden declared neutrality. In practice, that meant selling bearings to whichever side could pay, and both sides could. Every Luftwaffe fighter needed over 1,000 bearings. A single anti-aircraft gun needed 47. Ball bearings weren't a side component of the German war machine. They were in nearly everything it built. SKF's Schweinfurt subsidiary was legally named VKF, Vereinigte Kugellagerfabriken. Multiple wartime accounts say American planners used that name, not SKF, in their bombing target paperwork specifically so it wouldn't look like they were bombing a neutral Swedish company's factory. At points during the war, up to 58% of Sweden's bearing production went to the Axis side. Sweden was also selling to Britain and the US at the same time, both sides depending on the same neutral supplier. American intelligence agents infiltrated SKF's own plant in Gothenburg to track how much of its output was headed to Germany, spying on a company operating legally inside a country that wasn't at war with anyone. SKF's own founder was no bystander in any of this. Winquist socialized with Hermann Göring and other pro-Nazi figures, sometimes in the same circles as European royalty in exile. A director of SKF's American subsidiary, Hugo von Rosen, was related by marriage to Göring's family. He rerouted around 600,000 bearings a year from Philadelphia to Nazi-linked firms in South America on neutral Panama-flagged ships, slipping past the Allied blockade. In 1944, facing mounting pressure, the U.S. commercial corporation paid SKF roughly $5 million in a preclusive purchase deal, buying up a share of SKF's own export capacity, specifically so Germany couldn't buy it instead. On August 17, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force flew its first major raid on Schweinfurt's bearing plants. 60 of the 376 bombers sent were shot down. Production dropped about a third, then recovered within weeks. October 14, 1943 became known as Black Thursday. A second raid on Schweinfurt cost 60 more B-17s out of 291, one of the costliest missions the 8th Air Force flew in the entire war. Bearing production at the factories was halted for only about 6 weeks. Germany had built up large stockpiles and dispersed manufacturing to other sites. The raids that cost so many American lives barely dented output. Post-war analysis was split. Albert Speer privately called ball bearings Germany's Achilles heel. RAF Commander Arthur Harris disagreed, arguing all along that bearings weren't the weak point Americans believed them to be, and the production numbers mostly backed him up. Just before Sweden finally cut off Germany in October 1944, SKF's own Gothenburg director ordered the company's entire European inventory of bearings handed over to German authorities first. A parting shipment historians still debate the real motive behind. By 1944, American pressure on Sweden had escalated to a direct threat: stop the bearing exports to Germany, or risk having the Gothenburg factories bombed too, neutral country or not. Sweden negotiated instead of complying outright, gradually restricting exports through 1944 as the war's momentum shifted. SKF had spent years profiting from both sides. Nobody came out of it looking clean. SKF's American subsidiary in Philadelphia also supplied the Allied side, though later claims it single-handedly offset the Schweinfurt raid losses don't hold up. Its output was a small fraction of what Germany's own factories produced monthly. When the war ended, the German subsidiary became SKF Germany again in 1945. No reckoning, no prosecution, just a name change back, and the company moved on. The post-war decades were kinder, global manufacturing exploded, and SKF's bearings went into everything that turned: trains, ships, factory lines, and eventually the first generation of wind turbines. By 1970, SKF operated 67 factories across 13 countries and held more than 20% of the global bearing market, a scale no single competitor could match at the time. The company had become something close to invisible infrastructure, a name almost nobody outside industry recognized, sitting inside machines that almost everybody depended on. SKF also pushed into aerospace-grade precision bearings during this period, supplying parts that had to survive extreme heat, speed, and stress, a much higher bar than the factory shafts the company started with. By the late 1970s, Japanese manufacturers were entering the bearing market with lower costs and improving quality, building the competitive pressure that would hit SKF hardest 2 decades later. The good years didn't last. By the mid-1990s, SKF's profitability had slipped, and its largest shareholder, the Wallenberg family's investor AB, wanted answers. In 1997, Percy Barnevik became chairman of Investor AB and pushed several of its holdings, SKF included, to cut costs hard. CEO Peter Augustsson responded with a restructuring plan that October, cutting more than 2,000 jobs. That wasn't enough either. In June 1998, a second round followed, 4,000 more jobs eliminated on top of the 1997 Asian financial crisis that was crushing industrial demand worldwide. The board felt Augustsson wasn't moving fast enough. In September 1998, he was replaced by Sune Carlson, an executive pulled from ABB, who announced a third round, another 1,000 jobs cut, plus a plan to sell off non-core businesses. Across the 3 rounds, close to 7,000 jobs disappeared from SKF in under 2 years. Restructuring charges alone cost the company more than 3 billion kronor, and 1998 closed with a net loss on the books. These were hard years for SKF. Thousands of jobs were gone, and the company spent the rest of the decade rebuilding from a smaller base. The rebuilding was slow. Operating margins climbed from under 4% in late 1998 to about 9% by mid-2000, but it took years, not months. The 2000s brought a different strategy. Instead of just cutting costs, SKF started buying its way into higher-margin niches. In 2006, it acquired SNFA, a French maker of aerospace bearings running at a 19% operating margin. The company also pushed further into China and India as manufacturing shifted there, and expanded beyond bearings alone into seals, lubrication systems, and industrial condition monitoring sensors. That diversification mattered because bearings alone were becoming a commodity business in some segments. The margins were shifting to the software and sensors that could predict a bearing failure before it happened. Wind energy opened up as a growth market too. Large turbine bearings had to survive years of continuous rotation in remote, hard-to-service locations, a different engineering problem than a factory floor. Today, SKF and its German rival Schaeffler together account for roughly 36% of global bearing revenue. Neither dominates outright, and the 2 largest players still hold barely a third of the market between them. The rest of the field is crowded. Schaeffler posted 18.2 billion euros in 2024 revenue. Timken of the US brought in $4.6 billion, and Japan's NSK, NTN, and JTEC all compete for the same industrial customers. China is now the world's largest producer and consumer of bearings by sheer volume, but its industry remains fragmented, with no single Chinese company yet challenging SKF's position at the premium end. Fragmented for now. In other industries, SKF has watched that kind of gap close within a decade. Today, SKF employs more than 37,000 people and operates in around 130 countries. The company still owes its scale to one engineer solving one factory's foundation problem in 1899. The recent numbers are softer too. In 2024, SKF's revenue was SEK 98.72 billion, down close to 5% from the year before. Softness in a business people assume just keeps growing. The decline didn't stop there. By the fourth quarter of 2025, net sales were down another 11% year-over-year, even as the company managed to hold its adjusted operating margin near 12% through cost discipline alone. Weak automotive demand in Europe, cautious industrial spending globally, and looming tariff exposure on cross-border manufacturing all hit the numbers at once. No single cause, just several headwinds arriving together. Inside SKF's own numbers sat a persistent problem. The automotive division, about 30% of total sales, kept missing its margin targets no matter how many restructuring rounds it went through. The higher-margin industrial division, roughly 70% of sales, was effectively subsidizing the weaker automotive side year after year, dragging down the group's blended performance in the eyes of investors. Activist investor Cevian Capital, holding close to an 8% stake, began publicly pushing SKF's management to do something more decisive than another round of cost cuts. Cevian's specific ask was numeric. A standalone automotive company should be capable of at least a 10% operating margin, while the remaining industrial business should push even closer to its own long-standing targets once freed from the drag. On September 17, 2024, SKF's board announced a plan to split the company entirely, spin off automotive as its own separately listed business on the Nasdaq Stockholm Exchange. The market reacted immediately. SKF shares jumped as much as 7% on the announcement, investors betting that two focused companies would be worth more than one struggling to serve both. The Wallenberg family's investment arm FAM, holding about 15% of SKF, backed the split too, a rare moment of agreement between the founding family and an outside activist. The original target was a listing in the first half of 2026, ambitious for a company untangling more than 130 years of shared history, shared factories, and in some cases shared employees. On February 26, 2026, the new automotive entity finally got a name, SKF Vertevo from the Latin vertere, to turn or transform, paired with Evo for evolution. The listing timeline slipped too, from the first half of 2026 to the fourth quarter, still pending final board and shareholder approval as of the announcement. In its most recent year inside the group, automotive reported SEK 25.9 billion in net revenue, but only SEK 1.6 billion in adjusted EBITDA. That's the margin problem the spin-off is supposed to solve. In Schweinfurt, Germany, the same city whose bearing works were bombed under the name VKF 80 years earlier, employees learned about the split at short-notice works meetings, with uncertainty about their jobs and pensions. As of today, SKF Vertevo hasn't listed yet. Whether the split delivers the margin improvements both sides are promising remains to be seen. The problem SKF was built to solve in 1899 started with clay soil settling under a textile mill in Gothenburg. The bearings came after. More than a century later, the company is still adjusting to a shifting foundation: world wars, activist investors. The ground never quite settles. What comes next hasn't been written yet.